Now or never. This is how Japan is describing its population crisis. The country is on the brink of not being able to function as a society. Before we tell you more, listen in to the Japanese Prime Minister.
Our nation is on the verge of whether it can maintain its social functions. We cannot waste any time on the policies for children and children-rearing support. We must establish a children-first economic society and turn around the birth rate.
Yes, it's alarming, but let me break it down for you. Japan's population is 125 million right now. Last year, only 800,000 babies were born. For the last 14 years rather, the birth rate has been declining and now the country is seeing fewer births than ever before. To give you context, it used to be 2 million in the 1970s. That's more than the double that we see today. In the next 27 years, it could lose a fifth of its current population, which means Japan will be a country of less than 53 million by the end of the century. Tokyo is now focusing on policies in favor of childbirth. It is planning to double its spending on these programs, but experts say the response has been delayed. The population crisis today was an impending one. Then why did the government not push for policies before? Well, it did promote a few, but it has not been successful so far. Analysts say the situation is so dire, the government needs to be more open to foreign workers. This will mean relaxation in its immigration policies. But the government is very hostile when it comes to this. Only about 3% of Japan's population is foreign-born. And it's not just the government, even the people are not very welcoming to outsiders. So how did the world's third largest economy end up here? Well, it's a curse of rapid economic boom. Japan has seen exponential growth in the last few decades. It's of course a boon for the economy. More people are stepping out to work. Lifestyle is changing. Their incomes are better. Life expectancy has improved. But for the society as a whole, it has been a bane. Cost of living is soaring. The youth are refusing to get married or have children. And as a result, the birth rate has fallen sharply. So what is that leaving behind? A major chunk of old people. And there are declining numbers of workers to support them. Japan now has the world's second highest number of people who are above 65. This is 28% of the country's population. As we said, it's a curse, and it will not spare anyone. Till 2050. Europe's population is set to decline at the rate of 0.3% per year. South Korea's fertility rate is the lowest in the world. China reported its first drop in population in 60 years. India, which is a youth-led nation, is seeing a fall in the number of people who want to get married. For more on this, we are now joined by Professor Binoy Hardy Chartrand from Tokyo. He is an adjunct professor of political science at the Temple University. Thanks very much for speaking to WION. Now, Japan's demography crisis was imminent for a while. The government has introduced policies to tackle this issue, but clearly it hasn't seen much success yet. Why do you think that is the case?
Yeah, that's a great question. The issue is Japan is obviously not the only country that is suffering from very low birth rate, as you very astutely pointed out in your introduction. And so far in the history of the world, we have not seen any country that has been able to reverse the trend. So the fact that Japan is or has not been able so far to reverse these falling birth rate is not necessarily an indictment of poor policies by the Japanese government, but simply the reality that when countries start seeing their birth rates fall, it's very, very difficult to reverse. As you mentioned as well, we have seen policies by the Japanese governments over the years. There's been various types of efforts that have been made, but clearly the results have not been there. And this is exactly why we see an impending sense of impending doom, a sense of urgency. And we saw this very clearly with a speech by Prime Minister Kishida today.
Right. Now, many experts have suggested that it's time Japan opened up to immigrants. Do you think that is something that could yield results in this direction? And how do you see the Japanese society is likely to react to it? Because so far, we're given to understand neither the government nor the people of Japan are open to this idea at all.
Right. Well, obviously, immigration would be not necessarily an easy solution, but an obvious way to counter recent trends. If we look at other countries where the birth rates is also lower or has fallen, but where the population has remained stable or grown, and I can think, for example, of the United States, of Canada, of certain European countries, the reason why they have been able to maintain their population is through immigration policies that allowed a certain number of immigrants to come in to replace the number of or the falling birth rate in these countries. In the case of Japan, as you pointed out, there have long been a certain resistance to the population towards immigration. However, I must point out that there is more opening both in the government and also in a growing section of the population. The government understands that there's really no choice. And over the last few years, there's been more immigrants or more temporary workers, at the very least, coming from certain Asian countries, especially coming from Indonesia, Vietnam, as well as the Philippines. And the government has also spoken about increasing the numbers of these workers. But of course, the other side of the equation is the Japanese people. I think although many of them are still resistant to the idea, as I mentioned, you see in surveys and as well anecdotally when I speak to people around me, they are more they're starting to be a little bit more open to the idea of accepting immigrants. But of course, it's never the immigrant nation, of course.
All right, final question. Declining birth rate seems to be a challenge in other countries as well, especially China, South Korea, and parts of Europe as well. Some see it as a curse of the economic boom that we've seen in recent years. Would you say that some of these countries are perhaps headed in the same direction as Japan? China, for example, today has a very old aging population, and that has emerged as one of its biggest challenges, despite the fact that it has a strong and robust economy.
Absolutely. It's a really massive challenge for these countries. And I'm glad you mentioned China, because China this year, for the first time, has seen its population decline. And it's going to be very difficult for China to maintain its economic growth, which, as we know, the Communist Party places a lot of the legitimacy of the Communist Party is based on economic growth. And that's going to be difficult to sustain without a growing birth rate or immigration. South Korea as well has been experiencing really very low birth rates for quite a while. As you mentioned, it's also the lowest birth rate in the world. So all these countries are following the same road that Japan has already been following. So their eyes are turned on Japan and trying to see what Japan is doing. Of course, they're trying to find solutions of their own, but they're following Japan and trying to see what trends, or rather what policies their governments can take in order to avoid the crisis that Japan is currently facing.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for speaking to WION and sharing with us your perspective on what seems to be an emerging challenge for many countries, including Japan and China.
Thank you very much.